Okay, so Kohlberg's developmental theory of gender. So in other words, I'm going to just run through two cognitive theories of gender. So in other words, how we explain gender from a cognitive approach. First one is going to be Kohlberg. You remember this from class? Okay, so I'm just going to explain how you would outline the sort of descriptive fact knowledge bit of the essay. Okay, so Kohlberg believed children develop gender through 3 stages. You need to clearly label them, identify them, okay, and outline them very clearly. So first one is gender identity, roughly about 2 to 3. Here the child can label or identify their own sex, okay. So, and at some stage they will be able to also, at this stage, label another child as a boy or a girl. So in other words, at gender identity they can label boys and girls, including themselves. But at this stage, gender is just a label. So as far as they're concerned, that can be altered. So I'm a boy, he's a boy, okay? But they get very fooled by outward appearances. So it's really confusing for them. Okay, so boy might, if they see another boy with long hair, they would get confused by that and think possibly, or a boy in a skirt, that means they must be a girl, okay? Because it's just a label for them, right? So gender identity, roughly about 2 to 3. They can label themselves, but they can also label others and just say whether they're a boy or girl. So that really shows that by about the age of 3, they are starting to associate certain characteristics with the different sexes. Okay, all you need to know is that at stage 1, gender identity, they can label themselves, they can label others. Okay, stage 2, we call it the gender stability stage, roughly about age 3 to 4. And here they've learned an understanding, they've grown to have a cognitive, a sort of understanding that their own sex is stable and that's not going to change. They know that I'm a little boy, I'm going to be a daddy. I'm a little girl, I'm going to be a mummy. Okay, so by the time they're about 4, they've got a very clear idea that they will remain, that their gender will remain fixed. Okay, now the thing is, although they have that understanding that their own sex remains the same, they are still not able to apply that to other people. So even though little boy here knows he's a little boy, knows that he will become a man, he's not sure about somebody else. He can identify him as a boy, but he hasn't got a clue about whether that little boy there is going to end up being a daddy, a grown-up man, etc. So that is stability. The key is in the word stable. They know their gender is stable, so it will remain. Third stage, final stage, is gender constancy. Okay, so here they're starting to view gender as adults too. They start to decenter, which means that they're able to take more than one thing into account. So they're able to realize that everyone's sex remains the same. They're no longer fooled by outward appearances. So at constancy, that means that they understand that little boy is going to become a man, little girl is going to become a mummy, something like that. Okay, and what Kohlberg says is from gender constancy, they then start to actively seek out role models. Okay, so that's quite late on. Okay, so we're going to put in here roughly about 4 to 7. Okay, so rough idea about 4 to 7. That's quite late on really that they've got this understanding. Okay, they're no longer fooled by outward appearances. So 3 stages: identity, stability, constancy. You might be asked to write out a question that you could ask a child to identify, which stage they're at, and just need something really simple, like, or a child might say, if he to show that his understanding. So you might just say, I'm Tom, I'm a boy. I'm Tom, I'm going to be a daddy. All right, so just keep it really simple. If they ask you for some statement, that's what they've asked before in the past. So just keep it really simple. Okay, so what study? You need to have a study to support it, at least one study. Let's go with the Marcus and Overton, which is in your book. I think it's about page, what have we got? Yeah, page 70 in your textbook. Okay, so what did Marcus and Overton do? Okay, so look at the sample that they had. They had a sample with 3 age groups, starting from the age of 5 up to 8. Okay, so they had 5 to 6, 6 to 7, 7 to 8. And they were shown a little puzzle with either a male or female, and in that they were able to change the conditions. Okay, so you could change the hairstyle and also the clothes so that they looked like the opposite sex. You could also add in that actually what they did was with this puzzle, they used a condition where they superimposed the actual photo of the child onto the little character. Okay, and then they altered everything. They altered clothing, etc. And each time they asked them a question, is this a boy or a girl? Also, it's worth pointing out that when the photo version was used, so the actual participant's photo on the character, they were asked the question whether their sex had actually changed. So what did they find? They found that actually when they're using their own little faces, they were able to understand that a little bit younger. So if it was a little girl they were asking and they put her face there and then they changed the clothing, you know, she was able to understand that actually she was still a girl, a bit younger. But what they also found was that they got a little bit more confused with it when it was just a cartoony sort of character like this. Okay, so it was a little bit more tricky for them to understand. Older children were able to understand that, whether it was the cartoon character or the real photo. So what Marcus and Overton concluded was that the children, older children were not, younger children were not able to conserve that, were not able to understand that constancy until they were a little bit older, so until they were about 4 or so. Okay, so they concluded that they would not understand it. However, we've got to bear in mind there was a bit of a problem with that. And the problem is this: that was confusing for the children. Okay, they would have been easily confused by what they were being asked. It's possible, and the criticism is that it's possible they understood, they had that concept, as noted by the fact that when they used the proper face on the character, children did understand it at quite an early age, but they were just confused with the fact that they were being asked the same sort of question over and over again, and that may have given them the impression that somehow they were being given a kind of trick question, and they didn't understand the method that was used. That was the problem. So if you get 3 marks on the method used, right, all you have to do is outline this methodology. Right, get characters, cartoon characters, or even the actual photos of characters on a puzzle. Be able to swap the hairstyle and the clothing on the puzzle, and at each point ask the child, is this a boy or a girl? That's what we've used with Marcus and Overton. That's what Marcus and Overton did. Alright, so that would cover your methodology. The criticism, though, is it's possible that the child understood the concept, but actually what was being testing was their understanding of, not of gender constancy, but their understanding of actually the task. And it could be that they were confused by the task itself, as opposed to their concept and their understanding of gender stability. So that's Kohlberg's model. All right, gender, identity, stability, constancy. All right, so Kohlberg's cognitive model. Since then, the syllabus has asked us to, the board has asked us to cover another approach, another cognitive approach, and that's called gender schema theory. So that's on your notes as well. Okay, gender schema theory agrees with Kohlberg and thinks that we actively seek out role models. Okay, so again, this, it's a cognitive model because there's something that's going on between the stimulus and the response. We've got active processing involved. That's why it's cognitive. Gender schema thinks this occurs long before gender constancy. What do we mean by a gender schema? Okay, it's just a mental representation of the world that helps us to to understand the world, really. It's a bit like a stereotype. Okay, a gender script, same thing, but actually to do with routines, actions. That's all. So what does gender schema theory say? This theory says that at gender identity, i.e. roughly about 2 to 3, children look at the environment around them to try and learn gender schemas and to form stereotypes about what's okay for a girl and a boy. Okay, so girl with gender identity, she's observing other girls and she concludes that girls play with dolls. A boy with gender identity, he's going to look at what boys are doing. He sees that boys are playing rough and he thinks that's what boys do. Okay, so the first part is they look around and they're learning from that. Second part then, once they learn these schemas and scripts, they start to pay more attention to activities associated with their own sex. Okay, so a schema forms and they learn these little scripts and schemas that fits with that. So for example, it's okay for girls to wash up because that's what girls do. And they see that boys and girls do different behaviours. Okay, so maybe something like here, it's okay for boys to wash the car because that's what boys do. And what gender schema theory says is that any information that's consistent with that schema kind of feeds into it. It gets integrated into that schema. Okay, so it feeds into it. But if they come across something that's inconsistent, it's like they just ignore it. They don't always integrate it. So that helps their little stereotype, their little schema, to become very fixed and very inflexible and very rigid. Okay, so here, if they saw a little boy playing with a doll, that wouldn't really feed in, that wouldn't really be acceptable in their schema, so they tend to ignore that. See a little girl playing with a gun, doesn't work for them. But this works, girls playing with dolls, boys playing with guns, and so they would remember those bits. Okay, and this model says by the age of about 6, they've got actually a very good schema for their own sex, but unfortunately not until about 8 to 10 do they have a good schema for the opposite sex. So, the study to support this is Martin and Halverson. I've got down here, do you remember we did this in class, focus on the method and the research design and so on. Let's just have a quick look at that, just see whether you can answer some of these as we pause it. Okay, so the method used. Little experiment showing 5 and 6-year-olds pictures of people carrying out activities, and some of those activities, if you remember, were schema consistent. So for example, like a little girl playing with a doll, and sometimes they were inconsistent, so a girl playing with a gun. Okay, so that's the method. Experiment shown different schema, little pictures with schema consistent versus inconsistent, right? So that's like the little IV, and presumably an independent group's design. If we're just going for a basic model. Okay, who was their sample? We've already said 5 and 6-year-olds. What do they have to do? They just had to look at these different pictures, and then a week later they were given a recall of the pictures. And what did they find? What were the results? Results were that the schema consistent pictures were actually pretty well remembered, but when the schema inconsistent pictures were recalled, they were very often distorted. So what they found was the expected sex was remembered as carrying out the activity. So for example, they wouldn't remember a girl playing with a gun, they would remember it was a boy playing with a gun. So they remembered the gun, but not that it was a girl playing with a gun. So what did they conclude? They believe that actually children do use these schemas to help them make sense of the world, okay, to reorganize their information around them. But if it's consistent, that's when they remember it. If it's inconsistent, they won't remember it. So those are our 2 theories. Those are the 2 theories we need to just outline, a little bit of info on each of them. Make sure you've got a study on each of them. But that's not enough, because we also, of course, need to be able to evaluate those theories. So let's have a look at some notes on evaluating them. Okay, so we've got here, I've brought up another little document. It's a bit of a summary. We can use this one. Let's have a look at this. So we've talked about Kohlberg. Right, there's some key words that you would need to include. Gender schema theory. Keywords, Martin Halverson for gender schema. So let's have a look at the evaluation. Right, first of all, what have we got here? Okay, so it says belief in gender learning. They both believe that it's done through stages, okay, which suggests a biological input. So it's a nice comparison point with the biological approach, but the difference is, the thing that you would have to emphasize is that biological approach would say that our gender comes from our chromosomes and hormones and even brain structure, okay, so XX female, XY male, and so on and so forth. So nice comparison point. Yeah, certainly Kohlberg talks about the stages. That's a nice comparison, because if you're going through any stage theory, it has to be, there has to be some sort of biological input through developmental stages, and because it would be universal across the world. So it's very similar to the biological, but they believe in a learned thing. They also believe in role models, whereas the biological wouldn't. They would say it's all biological. SLT, nice comparison with social learning theory. Social learning theory, of course, believes that we copy and then we get a grasp of gender. Schema theory says it's the opposite, really. We get the schema and then we actively look to see what we should be copying. So there is a big difference with that. Okay. You can also compare it with the psychodynamic approach. Psychodynamic, we've just been talking about. Psychodynamic says it happens at the phallic stage. 3 to 5, 3 to 6, something like that. Identification with same-sex parent, internalization of gender roles, etc. So quite different with this. Okay, so make a comparison there. This is obviously saying we've got stages. Freud is obviously psychodynamic, saying it happens at one stage. Okay, so things like that. And Freud says you have to have the same-sex parents involved. And obviously these two approaches are saying other people can be role models. Number 4, it doesn't explain where a child might get their gender inappropriate behaviour from. So there is a little bit of a problem with this. This is saying that we're looking at role models just like with SLT. Well, what about gender inappropriate behaviour? It doesn't really explain fully how we learn. So how do we get that schema? It's saying that we get the schema. It's saying perhaps it would get gender identity, but not really fully explaining that. Also, the methods they've used to assess them, these have been criticised, as we've just said, because it may be that the children are really, we've got a lack of validity here. Are we really testing gender identity, gender concept, or are we really testing whether the child understands what the experimenter is asking them? That's a completely different thing, because then you're not actually asking, you're not assessing whether the child understands gender. So there are problems, flaws with the methods that have been used. If we also pull up another document, let me just show you this document. Okay, and we'll just go through this as well, just to pad it out a little. Just show you some of the things here. Your evidence to support only if it is supporting. So remember, the evidence that was used, for example, was the little puzzle in Marcus and Overton. And what they found was younger children got confused, etc. We've also got the Damon study, which is in your text. But if you remember, the 6-year-old thought it was wrong for George to play with dolls. Okay, very inflexible at the age of about 6. But let's have a look at other things. I've just briefly jotted things down. Alternatives, as we've just seen. Psychodynamic, for example, as an alternative. However, this one, the cognitive model, doesn't explain gender inappropriate behaviours, because gender schema theory says we'll only store appropriate information. So how would a child learn gender inappropriate behaviour? Okay, and then we've got that further criticism we've just mentioned about the type of questions used for the children. All right, it makes it an invalid test. It's not really testing, or the criticism is it's not really testing what they think they're testing. Validity is accuracy. Are they testing what they think? They think they're testing how old the child is before they've got a good concept of gender constancy. Other people are saying, no, 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 they were testing the child's ability to suss out what question you were asking. That's a very different thing. Okay.